Welcome to Wellsprings Community Church.
Chapter 8, as we've already read, and we look at these miracles. Those of you into, I've got my machine right. Yes, that's smaller than I'd hoped. Those of you into looking at your New Testament, you'll notice that these stories, the two of these accounts, the account of the leper and the account of the centurion, are recorded in Luke's Gospel, and the two don't come one after the other. There's a slight gap in the story. There's no doubt that Matthew deliberately brought these three stories together. It wasn't chronologically necessarily in order, but he brought these stories together in order to make a point. And so we have the picture of Jesus coming down. I always smile, actually, coming down from the mountainside, because actually when you go to the Sea of Galilee and look up, we wouldn't call them mountains. We would call them hills. But of course for them, and we're not used to going to places like Austria and everywhere else, they would have been mountains to them. And so we read Jesus comes down from the mountainside and he comes to what I thought was a village of Capernaum. Our children's Bible quite rightly describes it as a city, for in Jesus' time, apparently, there were as many as 1,500 people in Capernaum. It wasn't a small village. It contained quite a lot of people. And if you go there today, you can actually, there's a lovely church that's been built, and as you go into that church, the floor, part of the floor is glass. And as you stand and look into the glass, you will see the remains of Peter's house underneath where they've excavated it. So they excavated Peter's house. They then built this church on top, but so that you can see what has been excavated, you actually have a glass floor and you can look down into it. Capernaum was on a trade route. And of course, because of that, there would have been a tax collector's booth. And because it's interesting that Matthew immediately refers to Capernaum, because of course that would have been a familiar place to him as part of his profession as a tax collector before he came to Jesus. And so that's just a little bit of the background of this particular passage as Jesus comes and performs these miracles. The purpose of our series is to bring us to Jesus. And so as we look at this particular passage, we see three wonderful qualities of Jesus Christ. The first, Jesus' compassion. The Bible and Jesus himself made it clear that his ministry was to come to teach and then to die for each one of us. But such was his compassion that he could not walk past someone who needed healing without responding to them. That's God's love for his people. That's God's love for his creation. Jesus' great desire is to see us as we should be. And that's in our wholeness, not just, as it were, the spiritual side of us as we tend to divide it up. But Jesus' desire was to see his creation as it should be, as he'd intended it to be. If we go back to the very beginning of our Bibles and we read the story of Genesis, of course, we read the story of creation when everything was perfect. There were no diseases. There were no handicaps. It was perfect. It was what God intended it to be. And so as Jesus' heart went out to everyone he met when they were not as they should be, not just spiritually, but physically. And so his heart goes out to these three incidents of people who are in need. Matthew, of course, was using it to, as it were, underline that he really was the Messiah. Matthew's very much the gospel addressed, as it were, to the Jewish community. And Matthew's setting out and, as it were, proving that Jesus really was the Messiah referred to in the Old Testament. And as part of that, of course, he refers his readers to Isaiah 53, that wonderful passage about the Messiah and how he cured our infirmities and diseases. And so for Matthew, he was looking more than at compassion. But secondly, he brings these three together to show Jesus' authority in his world. We look around at a very troubled world at the moment. But as we look at this passage, it shows us that Jesus has authority in this world. And thirdly, it shows us that Jesus has power. Power to transform lives. Here was this itinerant preacher, as they would have thought, standing in their midst. And suddenly they see a demonstration of God's power to transform lives. And so as we look at this passage, we see his wonderful compassion for each one of us. That deep desire to see us whole in every part. It's very easy for us, I think, to concentrate always, as it were, on the spiritual side. But when Jesus looks at us, he looks at us as a complete person. Character, mind, body, soul, the whole. And that's what he wants to transform. And so let's look at these three miracles. They're three very different miracles. The first person that comes to Jesus would have been a familiar figure and a very tragic figure. Whether he actually suffered from leprosy as we know it, or whether he suffered from a very infectious skin disease, we don't know. And there's, needless to say, as there always is over these issues, a great deal of debate as to whether it was or wasn't. One thing is very clear, though. Because there was no cure for it, he had to be isolated. Because it represented a complete destruction of his body, and if it was leprosy, we don't know how far gone the leprosy was, but leprosy in those days particularly, would very gradually creep all over the body, limbs would drop off, and eventually, of course, it would cause your death. It was a very unpleasant and unsightly illness, and as a result, this poor man would have been totally isolated from his community. And yet he comes to Jesus. Apparently, so I was reading, which is something I didn't know, if the wind wasn't blowing in the right direction, you could come to within 2 meters of somebody. If the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, you had to remain 10 meters away. And obviously something to do with their view on how infectious diseases get transmitted. But one thing is definite. He looked at Jesus and believed that he could be made clean. And so this total isolated, rejected man comes and falls at Jesus' feet. And then Jesus does something that no righteous Jew would ever do. He touched him. For leprosy made people unclean. The leper could never be allowed inside the temple. He would always be treated as unclean as far as anything was concerned. And so no self-respecting Jew would go near him. But Jesus reached out and touched him. As you reflect on that, and it's a familiar comment on lepers, I just wonder what went through the man's heart and mind at that moment. To be touched by another human being. He'd never had that experience. How much he must have looked and watched others as families met up, hugged each other and everything else. But for him, touch was an alien experience. Jesus touched him. That's the compassion of Jesus Christ. That's how much Jesus understands how we feel. Yes, we said he had the power. And as the next miracle explains, he didn't need to touch him. He touched him, I believe, to show his compassion and his deep understanding of how that man felt. There are moments when I wonder, in my moments of doubt, it's these experiences that make me realize just how much Jesus understands how I feel. The second miracle is very different. Very different because, as we know, Jesus' ministry was to the Jews. And this centurion was a Gentile. As he said, he was a man under authority. Centurions it was a very favoured position in the Roman army. Great debate that one person describes the modern equivalent as a captain in the British army, trying to get some idea of the sort of seniority that centurions had. At least two, Vespasian was one, I can't remember who the other one was, at least two centurions became emperors. They were very important people within the Roman army. Now, why he was based where he was, again, produces the usual debates. But this man comes to Jesus. There's no record anywhere in the New Testament of Jesus ever entering a Gentile home. But he never rejected a Gentile. It didn't matter that the Jews felt that God's message was to them and them alone as the special people. Jesus wanted to demonstrate that his love, his compassion, his authority and his power reached out to all. It's very interesting in this passage. I was trying to think if there was another case, and I didn't. I should have gone through my New Testament. Jesus doesn't actually say anything. We normally expect him, like he did with the leper, to say, "Be clean." He doesn't. We have other occasions where he says, "Your faith has made you whole." But in this instance, he simply says, "Go home, your servant's healed." But just a moment. Jesus didn't touch him. Jesus didn't say anything like, "Come out of him" or "leave him." He simply said, "When you go home, it's done." It's a very striking miracle, this miracle of the servant. The centurion himself is very striking. It was permissible under Roman law, such was the brutality of the time in which Jesus lived, that if you had a servant who came ill and became useless to you, you were quite entitled to kill him. And that was often happened within the Roman Empire. That's how they treated their servants and their slaves. But this man treasured his servants, and it gives us a little bit of an indication of the quality of the man Jesus was dealing with. Luke tells us that he sent elders. There's a slight difference in the story, but they are actually compatible. Tells us that he was very good to the local synagogue. But Jesus simply says a word, "Your servant's healed." We have a glimpse of the wonderful power and authority of Jesus Christ. Nothing was beyond him. His compassion went out to this man. His compassion went out to his servant. And because of that compassion, the servant was healed. And then there's the third, and again, very different miracle. I can imagine by the end of the day, and it's good to remind ourselves, we hear about it when Jesus is in the boat when he's asleep, that Jesus, whilst he was the Son of God, was truly human. He did get tired. And one thing we don't fully understand, but Scripture makes clear, is when he healed people, power went out of him. We don't know how that worked. We don't know how that experienced, because we're not told. But we do know he became tired. He'd had a day with the crowds all around him. He'd come from teaching, and he'd at last got a chance to escape to go into Peter's house and have some food. And of course, the person who was due to give him the food was, of course, Peter's wife's mother. Keep on getting this wrong. Get that right. Peter's wife's mother. And she, we're told, in your NIV, you won't find it in Matthew, but you'll find it in Luke, that she was actually suffering from what they call a high fever. In other words, it really was not just a cold, this was a serious fever. And immediately Jesus now, this time, touches her, and the fever leaves her. I don't know if a number of us, probably most of us, have had COVID. A lot of us have had flu. And when we recover from flu, the last thing we want to do is bounce up and start doing housework and everything else. Why? Because we're left drained. But such is the quality of Jesus' healing that Peter's wife's mother gets up straight away and starts to prepare food. What about the after effects of the high fever? What about the tiredness? What about feeling drained? That's the completeness of Jesus' healing. That is his power and authority over all the effects of sin in a sinful world. So we have the leper, the rejected, the outcast. We have the Gentile, not even a Jew, outside, as it were, of the promises of God, so the Jews thought, but not outside God's love. And then we have this lovely homely picture of Jesus' miracles, not now, as it were, on the dramatic, but in a quiet, homely situation. As I looked at those, and those who would have observed it, we don't know the reaction of the Gentile, the Capernaum, the centurion. We don't even know the reaction of Peter's wife's mother. We know that the leper was overjoyed. I've often wondered, actually, put yourself in the position of the priest. He's sitting in his synagogue, and in comes a cured leper. What am I supposed to do? I've never ever seen one of these before. There's never been a cured leper. Did he rush to his scrolls and think, what did Moses say I have to do? Because he'd never ever done it before, and he never knew anybody else who'd done it before. How stunned he must have been to have seen this cured leper stand before him. What a wonderful reminder of the witness of Jesus' transformation in people's lives to people around. The priest, in inverted commas, the religious, the hard-nosed Roman army. What was their reaction? And then the lovely homely picture of Peter and the disciples. What wonderful encouragement that must have been to them. These miracles demonstrate the lovely compassion of Jesus Christ for his world. Not just, as it were, for the spiritual, but for the physical. That desire that we are the people God wants us to be. And you have to say, though, as you look at these miracles, they were only temporary. Now, I don't mean that they were not complete. For as we looked at with Peter's wife's mother, it was totally complete because she was physically able to get up and start doing work and everything else. The fever, 101% had gone. But what I mean is that these three would one day die. But my Bible tells me, and I know from my own personal experience, that there is final healing available to each one of us at the cross. Jesus not only was able to show his compassion and heal physically, but Jesus was to go to the cross and deal with the cause of all our needs. The physical, because our world, and we only have to go back to Genesis to realize this world didn't start with disease, it didn't start with infirmity, it started with completeness. And so when Jesus went to the cross, he paid the price for all that sin in order that one day there could be final and complete healing. that we would not only be healed physically and be given new bodies, but we could be healed spiritually. We could be forgiven for all that we have done wrong, all that we deeply regret. We could come to him, and because of the cross, we could ask for forgiveness. He could come into our lives. We could start to know the transformation that Jesus wants to bring for each one of us when we come to know him. Jesus' desire, as I said earlier on, is that we would be restored to what he intended us to be. And the wonderful truth is that is possible. In the short term, it's possible that we can be forgiven. In the long term, there will be total and complete healing when he returns or we go to be with him and we are given these new bodies. Boy, when I got up this morning and was trying to itch my back, my left shoulder told me that was not the wisest thing to do. A lovely thought that all that's going to be put right. Isn't it lovely? I mean, no longer the struggles with our ailing bodies. No longer the struggle with our mental issues. No longer the struggle with our physical issues. No longer a struggle with those things that nag away at our minds and our hearts because of things we've done and said or should have said or should have done. We can be forgiven. We can be healed of these things. And one day we can know complete healing. So what for us today? Miracles do still happen today. I was very interested in reading one of the commentaries, and the commentator said, I have long since repented of my earlier doubt that miracles take place today. Miracles take place today. Yes, we don't see them in the way we did in Jesus' time. The lovely end of that passage was all the people with demons all coming into Jesus and him healing them. We don't see that today, but we do see miracles today. One thing that we look at, it's not so clear with Peter's wife's mother, it is with the other two, is what was the key to the healing? It was faith. It was the real belief that Jesus really could do something about their situation. Miracles are available today, but we need to have faith and believe. A faith that is real. When he threw himself at Jesus' feet, this desperate leper had every faith that Jesus, he didn't know why, but Jesus really could do something. How often when I pray do I really believe that Jesus does something? Or am I praying because, well, I've always prayed for these things, and I'm a Christian, and I believe these things, but how much do I really believe them? The amazement that Jesus showed at the Gentiles' faith. One of the things that I've experienced is laying on of hands. James 5:14 and 15 tells us that if there's a sickness, we're to pray and call the elders to lay hands on us. It's perhaps not something we do, maybe as often as we should. I can remember years ago, and I'll go back a bit, we had a lady in our previous church. She had become a Christian. She was an ex-alcoholic. She actually came from a good background. And she had a little daughter, sweet little girl. And then, unfortunately, she was diagnosed with cancer. And the Marsden told her that it would be fairly rampant. And a few of us felt, as we looked at that little child, that we should pray for her to be healed, not necessarily for life, but we believed it was right to ask God to heal her or to stem the cancer so that our little child could grow up and not be left as an orphan. And so we went to, she very much agreed. We went round to her we laid hands on her and we prayed for her. When she next went to the Marsden, they could not believe why the cancer hadn't spread, why it was as though something had stopped it in its tracks. And that remained for years. It wasn't a case like so often occurs, in a year or two it fires up again. Carol knew that stemming of her cancer the whole way until her daughter grew up and her daughter got married. We knew why the cancer had stopped, even if the consultants didn't. And although they regularly monitored her, they kept saying, it just hasn't grown. Miracles do happen. We need to pray over everything. I believe one of the reasons that Matthew gave us this lovely homely story of Peter's wife's mother. Why slip that in with the dramatic? It wasn't leprosy. It wasn't a servant dying. It wasn't demon possession. It was someone with a high fever. But I believe it shows us that Jesus is interested in every part of our lives, not just, as it were, the dramatic, though that's ever so important, but also in the smaller things in our lives, in our home experiences. And he wants us to bring these things to him. But of course, not all are healed. I've experienced it in my own family. You pray and you pray and you pray, and there appears to be no answer, and the person dies. Then you pray and you pray and you pray, and the person's healed. Why? Why, Lord, did you do that for one and not the other? And do I know now why? No. But what Jesus asks us to do is to trust him. To keep in our hearts the knowledge that he has the power and authority. To hold on to the fact that one day we will be healed totally. Our prayers will be answered totally. It may be in the short term. It may not be. But that total healing is available through Jesus Christ and the cross. But in the meantime, he wants us to bring everything to him in prayer. To really believe that he can, as it were, get involved. Not just in the big things, but in the small things as well. Not just the major things. Not meant irreverently, but would it have mattered if Jesus had had to wait a little bit longer to have his meal and Peter's wife's mother was still ill? No. It's Jesus had compassion on that situation. And as we sit here this morning, no doubt, with some very personal things that are very personal to us, Jesus has compassion on that situation. Years ago in our house group, we had a lovely lady. She had a remarkable story. She'd been in, as a child, she'd been in a Japanese camp in Hong Kong. And she became a Christian. And we were sitting around the supper table before our Bible study together. And she was sharing something that was troubling her. And I said, Lillian, you know, you should be praying for this, and we should be praying. Oh, I couldn't do that. I said, well, why not, Lillian? Well, it's just something personal to me. I mean, it's not something important like things that happen on other people's things that I can pray for. I couldn't pray for that. So I had to sit with her for a few minutes and share with her that God cares for everything. That we take everything to God in prayer, as the chorus or song says. Not just the big things. Jesus is involved in the big things, the lepers and the Gentile servants. He's also involved in the human and the local and the personal. Peter's wife's mother. And if, in God's sovereign will, we do not see the healing we desire, If we've come to know him, if we've come to that point of recognizing that Jesus' death on the cross was actually for me, and each one of us can say that, and if we asked him to forgive us and come into our lives, we will notice the transformation in our lives immediately. But we may have to wait for the completion of the healing to one day. But one thing the Bible makes very clear is that Jesus will return, that everything will be put right. We will be given these super new bodies, not just floating around, as it were, as little spirits in the air. We will be given new bodies. And Jesus' desire to see us totally transformed will be complete. In the meantime, let's not forget that miracles still happen today. Whether those miracles are in a big way or a small way. I always remember being on a youth weekend, and to my horror, just before I was due to speak, I totally lost my voice. Now that's a blessing to some people, but in this particular case, it was a real issue. And I thought, what am I going to do? I can't sort of sit and wave pieces of paper around to these young people. And as those of us who have worked with young people know, you do need to have a fair amount of enthusiasm as you're doing things. Lord, what am I going to do? Answer? Pray. It wasn't that major, but wonderfully, when I got up to speak, I had a total voice. God cares for the little things and the big things. But if we struggle on and we're not healed, if God chooses not to intervene, if we know him and trust him, there will be a final healing of body and of soul one day. And that's what we're going to sing about. I'm conscious that I tend to be the one person who always chooses this song, but it's a particular favourite of mine, but it's also a favourite of mine because of the words. And those words remind us that we have a wonderful future to look forward to, not just because of God's love. Said in the right way, God's love was not sufficient. The song says it's because of your blood. Jesus had to sacrifice. Jesus had to deal with the sin which causes so much havoc in our world. And he was willing to do that by dying for each one of us on the cross. And because of that, we have a wonderful future to look forward to. And a reminder that he's active and working in the present. Let's stand to sing. Marilyn, thank you. I love the way Marilyn plays this song.